This is the AppNeta webinar on how to be a cloud broker. We're still waiting for some people to show up. People are still trickling in, so we're going to wait for just a couple minutes. So hold tight, and we'll be right with you. Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the AppNeta webinar, How to Be a Cloud Broker. Thanks for everyone joining us this afternoon. I'm extremely excited about this webinar because I think it's a really interesting topic. Cloud broker, as we'll learn, is an emerging new position that's coming, that's starting to appear in corporations. And we thought it'd be interesting to do a webinar talking about where this role comes from and how it affects IT. But before we get started, I wanted to do some introductions. My name is Damian Roskill, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at AppNeta. And I'm joined on this webinar by my partner, Alec Pinkham, who's our Senior Product Marketing Manager. Now, we all know that the cloud has matured to the point where it's a robust industry with platforms and services to meet just about any corporate need. But at the same time, we've started to see this new role appear both within and outside corporations. It's called the cloud broker. These are people that are experts in the procurement and ongoing management of cloud service providers, and their job is to help organizations adopt cloud in a way that doesn't slow the organization down, but still takes into account issues like security and procurement and all those standard processes. At the same time, IT personnel have been trying to figure out how they operate in this new world of cloud. This new role presents an amazing opportunity for IT to take their existing technology knowledge and leverage that across cloud deployment. But IT has to be aware that being just a technology leader is only part of the job, and that they may have to develop new skills in order to play in this world. And that's what this webinar is all about. There are a couple key steps in moving towards the kind of in-house expertise that IT teams need to have in this new cloud world. And adding these skills will help IT charge take control of its fate. We'll be covering three main areas in the webinar today. The first is an overview of why IT needs to step up, and I'll be talking about that. Then I'll be passing it to Alec, who's going to talk about three areas. One, choosing the right partner. That's how to choose the right cloud broker for your corporation, what you need to take into account. Two, crunching the numbers. So we're going to talk about pricing models and the reinforcement of business value as part of the process of bringing cloud into your organization. And then three, what we call mastering the business side, or how to be business savvy. And so this is really about how to work with other groups across your organization so that you can be a Sherpa for business and department heads through the cloud procurement process. So let's get into it. So I guess the first question that somebody might want to ask is, oh, yeah, whoops, I forgot to go through logistics. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Today's webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording will be sent out to everybody who has signed up. And if you're having any questions, please put them in the question box as part of GoToMeeting. Feel free to put in those questions anytime. We'll answer them. If there's something that we're showing on the screen that you think is particularly interesting, feel free to put it in. We may answer it right on the spot. And if you're having difficulty, please, the simplest thing to do is just try a different browser. So with that, let's get into it. All right, so the first question to ask is really why IT needs to adapt. So before we get into the changes that IT needs to make, I wanted to provide some context for the change. There are really two primary forms of cloud adoption out there at the moment. The first is where organizations take existing applications that might live in a traditional data center or hosting provider and move them to the cloud. SaaS application adoption is the second form, where companies move off traditionally delivered internal applications to apps that are delivered from the cloud. What's important to note in both of them is although IT may or may not have been involved in the purchase of each service, they are effectively on the hook for their performance. When a large company moves to G Suite or to Office 365 and a person in a remote office has a slow app experience, they don't call Google or Microsoft, they call IT. The question for IT then is how are you going to provide visibility into applications where you don't control the infrastructure? And we're really just at the beginning stages of cloud deployment. For example, Gartner estimates that most organizations have about 3 to 5 public cloud service providers at this point. But while cloud still represents a small portion of the application deployment that's going on, it's growing very rapidly, about 20% in 2016 according to Forbes. The important point is that it's going to be the deployment of the future. So it represents 80% of future deployment. That means that while the skills you have right now, or the skills that traditional IT has had, that being the builder of boxes and the backup of servers and all of those skills, still have value now, but that value is going to decline over time. What you're going to see happen is that as more and more of the workload shifts to the cloud, those existing skill sets are going to lose value. So IT really has to think very, very carefully about how they're going to move forward into the cloud. There's no avoiding it. So I guess the only question is how is IT going to evolve based on these changes? If cloud computing fundamentally changes IT's role, proactive IT leaders need to get ahead of the new requirements and challenges. And that means moving from being, as I like to say, a builder of boxes to a buyer of services. Interesting though, IT teams are very well regarded when it comes to technology, but there is a perceived skill gap amongst C-level business leaders. This Accenture study that I put up here on the screen found that an overwhelming 88% of people think that IT should be a part of those transactions, part of those purchases. That's great. So the C-suite believes that IT has value to bring to those transactions and to those purchases. But in the same survey, they found out that 78% of those same respondents think their IT department may lack the skills to help them with cloud or as-a-service purchases. And those numbers are a call for action. IT leaders should start thinking of themselves as in-house cloud brokers who understand business value and the implications of IT purchases. If they become invaluable and save time and money, then they're going to be able to add more value to that business in the world of hybrid and multi-cloud infrastructure. Bottom line is that IT can move outside just being considered a technology solution provider to being a provider of business services. And that's the real exciting opportunity for IT moving into the future. And with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Alec, who's going to walk through the 3 critical areas that we concentrated on.
Great, thanks, Damon. So based on those metrics alone, it's kind of clear that IT can't continue in this way. We can't continue to have that perception from the executive suite or the C-level suite. So IT needs to be kind of an essential, thriving part of the organization. If IT team members can start approaching cloud adoption, finances, and purchasing differently, they, and kind of more specifically you, can make yourselves essential not only to the network infrastructure, but technology in general. So the end result there will be an IT team that has not only a voice in the boardroom, or more ideally budget to spend on cutting edge technology or other interesting projects that are going to help efficiency down the road. So kind of how do you prove your worth here? Well, we've got a few steps that are kind of coming up that will help. But if there's the one thing that we've seen over and over, it's that cloud platforms and SaaS apps are kind of extremely visible. So oftentimes that's because of poor performance. So, you know, regardless of whether or not you've done a stellar job setting it up in record time or half the cost, the performance is still going to be the most visible thing after day one. So with that in mind, where do we start? So first up, we need to choose the right partners to work with. With most modern organizations, these partners will fall into a few different categories. As Damien mentioned earlier, we've got cloud providers in the public cloud like AWS or Azure. For use cases like hybrid cloud and cloud bursting, those can also be used. But we've also got the SaaS apps that we connect to through the open internet. We've got our ISPs that help us connect to those SaaS apps. And my job isn't to choose the right one for you here, but to give you some considerations to think about when you're dealing with these decisions. One note as well here is that shadow IT, you know, and with shadow IT kind of being in a bunch of different offices now, you may not always be a part of these decisions, but as Damien mentioned, you'll definitely be the first ones that people call if those apps are slow. And so it becomes kind of our responsibility to know the impact of these apps on the business as a whole. So I want to split the things that we're going to talk about here into two sections, really. The upfront kind of static considerations that we need to look at, and then the dynamic performance one a little later on. So upfront, you'll want to check out where the closest data center is, and we're talking about cloud providers here. So where's the closest data center that, you know, based on the providers that you're investigating? Most large providers will have several to choose from. They'll call them regions, or in AWS's case, their availability zones. But it immediately kind of brings up the second question, which is going to be whether or not the data centers are in close proximity to the intended user. We're talking the end user here. So if you're internally using these apps or data that you have in the cloud, you'll want the provider close to headquarters or your office. If you're providing a service, it's best to ask around. Sales or customer-facing roles should have a good idea of where the customers are. These discussions should also bring to light whether or not you need to offer multiple regions via replication or content delivery systems to limit the latency for those end users. Next up is the cost of the provider. Again, an obvious one, but the most important aspect of this cost model in the cloud is that they're most often dynamic. So with a fixed IT budget, typically, a dynamic cloud provider can be somewhat difficult to work with, but we've actually got some stuff to talk about that in a bit. So upfront, you want to match your use case with the cost concerns. Are you using the cloud for extra capacity, as in a bursting model, perhaps providing a web app, or even just doing data backup? Every cloud provider has a unique but often flexible cost model that will scale with use. So that's going to be a crucial aspect to success here, is not only understanding it, but also picking the right one. And last of the initial considerations will be the deployment itself. While the big cloud providers have generally made their services easy to expand and otherwise architect, you want to make sure that the deployment itself will be easy to roll out and the maintenance will be simple. So again, another one that sounds obvious, but it's a box you want to check up front and not find out later on. Before we finish up on the cloud providers, there is a dynamic consideration to think about. So what kind of performance do your users require? This will be tied to your use case and what your users are doing with an app or a service. But if you're migrating a business critical app that used to be on premises, you're trading that 5 to 10 milliseconds of latency for 50 to 100 milliseconds at peak performance. And typically more than that when you're putting basically physical distance and logical distance with additional routers and switches in the way, basically between your users and the app, that will add complexity to the application delivery path that you're trying to monitor. So as an example here, we actually have at the bottom, we've got an end user experience product here executing the same script against the same demo CRM system that we've set up in Azure, AWS, and Google. So it's the same system set up in 3 different locations, but they're all hosted in the Northwest region or availability zone. And our synthetic user here is actually in Seattle. So the difference in performance for even kind of basic tasks is pretty big. We've got hovering around 2 seconds, just under 2 seconds for AWS, where we're almost double that for both Azure and Google. Some may see that as kind of AWS being the market leader, but we've actually run this test from New York, Atlanta, and a few other US cities. Almost without fail, we get different results. So, welcome to the age of the internet-delivered app there.
So, Alec, we've got a question here, which is, where's this chart from?
Yep. So this is actually from our App View product. It's what's called a comparison view. So we've grouped the 3 scripts that we're setting against the 3 different cloud providers from one location. So these are all coming from Seattle. We've also got the same comparison view from New York, Atlanta, and others. But it's the idea of being able to compare performance from ideally here different locations or 2 different apps. So this one's from AppView, which is our end user experience product. Cool. So talking about SaaS apps, the other aspect here of choosing the right partner is going to be the SaaS apps that your organization use. So I'll be honest here, IT doesn't always have a big say. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But it is essential to be part of that discussion so that you know what to expect as far as kind of the greater network impact of these SaaS apps. With Shadow IT bringing in random department-specific apps, you want to be constantly monitoring the network to see when this new traffic pops up. So regardless of origin, IT and IT ops is still going to be on the hook for performance, as Damien mentioned before. So really, the wave of apps that are now available via SaaS models instead of traditionally on-premises deployments pushes the boundary of what we used to think of as SaaS. Entire businesses, including here at AppNeta, run on SaaS apps. Our IT has to filter kind of the signal from the noise here when it comes to these apps and identify which ones are business critical and which are not, which can be difficult if you've actually never heard of the app. So, which apps also in that same light affect the most users and which are kind of only used by a smaller subset of employees. So based on the examples here, Office 365 is going to affect every user in your organization. Unlike SaaS apps with smaller footprints, IT will probably be relied on for both purchasing support, rollout, and most likely have a say in the purchasing process of something like Office 365. But once purchased, the burden's going to fall on IT ops. So delays are going to be noticed when transitioning from kind of the negligible latency of on-premises to the wider internet performance, and so that'll actually be watched really closely. Another example here is Salesforce affecting sales operations, and potentially executives for reporting purposes. Downtime is probably unacceptable for an app like this, but Salesforce actually avoids that most of the time. We tend to say here, up is the new down. What about additional latency to that app? So with Salesforce, you're getting calls from the sales team if it slows down. But again, you're probably not picking Salesforce as the IT group. You just have to support it. So knowing when it's on the network and what's actually happening with it is something that you're expected to do, but you're probably not asked to do. So once these providers or kind of SaaS apps are in place, we can actually move on to essentially our second piece.
Before you go there, Alec,
yeah.
It strikes me that there's also another class of sort of applications, things like ERP applications that might be integrated into manufacturing processes that are moving to the cloud pretty aggressively, but they're, again, like the performance becomes even more critical in those kind of situations as well. So it's not just these broad-based applications, right?
Yeah, definitely. All right, so moving on to the second part here, crunching the numbers. IT has to stay under budget. Everyone does, really, but justifying the purchases and managing kind of the modern pricing cycles, which are very different from our historical view of buying hardware every few years and upgrading that software on-premise. Cloud kind of involves making a lot of long-term financial decisions that are more operational expenditure based instead of the capital expenditure. You're paying for them over time, but you're paying them as you use them, and in some cases by the amount of which you use them. So IT now has to manage the subscription as well as the performance of these apps. So you also inevitably have to justify these cloud investments to management teams and should get a handle on the IT investment basics for modern infrastructures. So what does this mean for IT teams? Well, cloud adoption and management may involve entire areas that you're used to be able to mostly ignore. The chief among these is dynamic finances. So traditionally, the fixed pricing models for apps gives way to variability in the cloud world. So with IT budgets fixed yearly, someone on your team is likely already dealing with this problem. But in an effort to become a cloud broker for these platforms and agreements, there are a few things that you're going to want to learn and focus on. So let's go through some of these. First is going to be the model. Pricing models vary from app to app. Most models are based on some unit of usage over some period of time. So that usage can take the form of the number of API calls, the number of users, the number of reports, or other kind of arbitrary units, depending on the use case. Many new to SaaS will think that users or headcount falls into kind of a different category. But we at AppNeta and I would like to kind of challenge that by asking, what happens if something radical changes in your business? What if the number of users doubles in 3 months? What if it's cut in half? Monthly billing can vary widely based on these changes. So what happens to your yearly contract when this happens? If your users increase, your contract might dictate that you jump up to a new pricing tier. Or worse, if users fall, you might actually basically end up paying more per head until your next renewal date. So negotiating the terms of the contract with the kind of the best and worst case scenarios in mind is kind of essential to protecting your budget. And we've actually seen this problem with other kind of usage scenarios with other companies in our market that have such complex pricing that changing the number of times per hour that you're running monitoring or testing can actually increase your price tenfold. All right, the next piece here is going to be forecasting. It's the next big part of crunching the numbers, because if you're starting out with SaaS, or even if you're just starting out with a new app, you have no data really to reference. So first you need to try to assess how likely things are to change based on our first point here. Is there flexibility in the contract to change upwards? What about downwards? Pre-negotiating the prices on advanced tiers for both cases can actually be incredibly helpful for larger enterprise-wide contracts. If the app or provider is based on a unit that you can actually benchmark, you should see what you've historically used. And kind of more important would be how variable it is over that time period as well. So when buying space on something like AWS, you're not just looking at the number of servers you have, but how often do you have to spin up extras, or how often are these servers over or underutilized? For SaaS apps, is the number of users you're charged for concurrent users, or kind of a one license per login model? One accounts for scale and the other doesn't really. So with a primarily fixed IT budget, you'll want to leave some headroom in case you overutilize 1 month during the year, or if you want to turn more tests on or do a little bit more with the product. Many apps like kind of Salesforce group packs of users. So getting discount tiers for what would be the next pack that you would go to, if you get those discount tiers in place up front, that's actually going to help you in the long run. Another part, a kind of subtle part of forecasting here, is the idea that every time you add a SaaS app that either a large amount of your company or most of your company will use, you're essentially adding to the total IT cost per employee. And so, one exercise we actually ask people to do is see if you can calculate that value, and so that when either hiring occurs, you know exactly how much is added to your operating costs, but also being able to communicate with finance and HR will help them identify what the real cost of hiring or growth is going to be for the company. And so the last one here is going to be considering negotiation basics in this cloud world in terms of service level agreements. So For example here, SLAs include a lot of variables, and cloud services performance can kind of vary every month. Consider details like the penalty of a provider for violating an SLA and how you're going to recover costs or credit from that provider. Financial motivators can also be a part of SLAs. IT should try to level the playing field a little bit with this when negotiating. It's also worth re-examining older SLAs or contracts already in place to see if you can get some better terms. Pay attention to the details here, such as whether it's too easy for service providers to kind of not fix recurring problems. And some of the other SLA negotiation metrics that we talk about are kind of availability, mean time to resolution for issues, security standards, the resolution path that issues will take, the cloud data ownership, and also recovery guarantees of these SaaS app data. So there are definitely others, but it'll actually depend on the type of app and how critical it is to the business and whether or not you spend time actually fully negotiating those SLAs. So our third point here, and perhaps one of the ones that we don't talk about enough, and I think our customers and IT doesn't do enough, is that you can't just stay ahead of the curve by learning new technology anymore. You have to learn new processes. You have to empower yourself and your entire team to become smarter buyers in this new world. So the big goal is that IT becomes kind of a valuable voice in the enterprise decision-making process and an asset to management and executive teams. So success in this will mean that you are brought into the buying process early and more often, and if you're perceived as kind of enabling these instead of being a blocker here. So where do we begin? Which details of the other departments and which processes should IT understand? We're going to start with, remember that you're the tech expert in your organization. So even though shadow IT may be creeping in with departments purchasing and utilizing SaaS apps without your knowledge, so remember that you're the tech expert. And so you know best when it comes to maintaining and monitoring your network to meet overarching performance goals. It then makes sense for you to be the trusted advisor when it comes to purchasing. So to do this, you'll need to educate your organization. Every department should be aware of the kind of true cost of SaaS, and your job may be to walk them through it. By enabling them to understand the pricing models they're agreeing basically the pricing models they're agreeing to, you can actually ingrain yourself in the process without blocking them from purchasing and using the apps they need to be productive. So whether or not you're on the budgetary hook or they are, you'll still need to support this app going forward. So if it's slow or down, they're going to come to you regardless of whether or not you own it. This kind of often manifests as complaints of slow Wi-Fi or internet connections. With continuous monitoring, you can actually identify whether or not that's true. If it is, you can fix it. If not, you'll need to know who to contact on the other side. And if you're not part of the process or the discussion, this is going to be much tougher to accomplish. So next up is to understand how finance at your company operates and how they like to see or use purchases. So for example, do they prefer annualized upfront payments or monthly payments? What are the purchase cycles that they're used to or that they prefer? To start, you're going to need to identify the current relationship between IT and finance. If you cross paths only during kind of budget allocation season, then we recommend kind of making a bigger effort there. Showing your knowledge of the payment process as well, especially with these more complex SaaS models, and actually giving the business value along with that model of all these apps will eventually allow finance to use you as kind of an invaluable resource. So finance is eventually paying for these, so you might as well give them the value while also helping them understand the model.
The other thing is that we're talking a lot about your position inside the organization, but the other side of it is there are vendors out there, and you want to be able to smooth the process for them. And so it strikes me that by having these skill sets, and being that trusted advisor, you're going to make that process for them smoother too. If they understand, these are the 4 steps we got to go through.
Yeah, and you don't actually have to use this as a big initiative where IT is going to do this. Focusing on kind of the smaller efforts of proving IT value to the business as either kind of a knowledge base or a resource there, we can actually lower that stat that you talked about earlier that mentioned 78% of the executives not actually thinking that you're able to operate in this era, right? Showing not only knowledge of the cost model, but how the process works is going to help you there. And so the final component of kind of IT ingraining themselves in the business processes is that when you're looking for a budget for a new product or helping solve a tech problem, if you can get in the habit of making the business case for the tool, it's gonna really help you in the long run. So will the tool save time? Will it eliminate manual tasks or manual aggregation of resources? What about cost savings, such as on capacity or server space? You can often match the technology solution features up with the potential business improvements. So with the tightening budgets and pressure on IT, it's important to note tools and processes that save you money or time or help desk tickets. So it'll be helpful to have the info on business value as you're going through the purchasing process. Depending on your organization, purchasing may go through separate finance, procurement, security, and other teams. So you probably actually have to get approvals you need and ultimately the product or service you want faster if you have insight into your internal organization and what data they need to convince them of value. So, for example, the security team may need access to validations, documents, or security information, while procurement has kind of its own requirements around bringing in a new tool.
It's interesting. One of the things that I see as we see new customers come on board is that the place where I think IT struggles the most is actually in this idea of building a business case or ROI. So I think that's really a big opportunity for them going forward if they can develop that skill set to really bring much more value to the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you've kind of gained these business and finance related skills that'll actually help you improving that business value, it's essential to be able to prove that these SaaS apps with the cloud services are working like they're supposed to. So your great tool purchase is only as great as the value it can provide to the users. So with a forgiveness for a quick pitch, that's where we come in. So AppNeta delivers all this insight through our one unified platform, the AppNeta Performance Manager. We have three main components in this. Flow view on the bottom left allows you to identify application traffic across your network, while path view at the top focuses on active, continuous, hop-by-hop monitoring from user to destination with the aim to determine end-user experience over the LAN, the WAN, and the last mile in the case of SaaS apps. App view on the bottom right is our synthetic transaction monitoring tool to monitor from inside or outside the firewall and bring in that network context from path view. So kind of this tool allows you to monitor all aspects of end user experience with easy to use SaaS service. It's also available on premise, but we also offer API access along with a bunch of other integration methods to allow you to bring your data and your performance data wherever you need it. But with that, I'll actually transition over to questions.
Great, we have a couple of questions. Let me start with Edward's question. He's wondering if there will be a training certificate available for cloud brokers soon, if you've heard anything in the industry as sort of this new position emerges.
So I haven't heard of anything specifically of anybody providing that certification yet, but I think we're going to see it very soon. I spent a lot of time talking to people in the analyst community, that's Gartner and Forrester, and they're talking a lot about this role, and that usually is a precursor to certification vendors stepping in and starting to think about it. So for those certification vendors that are out there listening, this is an opportunity for you.
Good, and the other question from Michael that I see is sort of on the topic of forecasting and a little bit around how you predict some of the things you were talking about with the cost per employee. And he mentions that you should forecast how long you think it will take you to become fully operational, and then assume an amount of time necessary if you need to migrate away at the end of the contract. So say you sign a 24-month deal, maybe estimate that you need 6 months to stand that up, and then by month 17, you got to start thinking about your migration plan. What do you think about that sort of timeline and the idea of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely prudent to have a timeline in there, and I think the other part here is that if you're working with a SaaS, kind of app vendor, it's also going to be nice if you can kind of set up an onboarding time where you're not paying maybe the full price when you're first doing the first piece of the rollout. When you have either one device or one VM running, you shouldn't be paying for all of it. So you can actually build that into your cycle in the contract. And a lot of vendors should see that as not only you wanting to have more value in the product, but also you're trying to use it to its best ability, and engaging in that onboarding process can really help.
I think it's an awesome addition to what we've been talking about here. It's just thinking long term, and again thinking holistically about the total cost of that service is incredibly important. And I think that there's kind of two areas that IT needs to think about. One is, I think, getting data in and getting data out. The other area is integrations with other services inside the organization. So when we look at, like, you bring in Salesforce, great, or you bring in NetSuite, whatever the tool is, are there going to be integrations that are going to be required, and how much time are those going to take, and how long will those take to stand up? But awesome comment.
Yeah. Yep. He also mentioned that, if you're happy with operations with your provider about renewals and extensions, month 17 might be a good time to bring that up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
We're bringing up the renewal early, get it so that it's committed. Obviously, also taking into account your financial, whether your financial quarters or your financial year is the other thing to think about in that.
And just one more, I think we've just got time for one more question, which is a little bit more about, as we're sort of talking about working with providers and SaaS applications, what kind of financial penalties have you seen? Are there any strategic ways to think about that?
I think the most important strategic thing to think about with it is related back to the unit of purchase. So some organizations are going to like you buy the cloud service, and it's literally could be done by the minute or by the hour, in which case you've got a very clear path to talking about the dollars. But where it gets a little more hazy is when you have like per user costs and estimating those. So if it's an outage and it lasts X number of minutes and it affects Y number of users, then you can very quickly calculate what the penalty should be, but it's relating it back to whatever the purchase was. I don't know, anything you want to mention on that, Alec?
No, I mean, I think definitely the unit is the biggest piece in the power there, because actually like breaking it down to however you're going to end up paying for it is a great way to kind of have it fit within their cost model, but also kind of give you a concrete way to get some feedback there.
All right. Well, I think that's it. We've gone over, and I apologize for that. We try and keep these to 30 minutes because we like everybody to have the ability to have lunch. So we've blown it by 10 minutes. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the content enough to hang around. Alec, thank you so much for the presentation, and we hope to see you guys again on a future webinar. We will again be sending out the recording following this, so if you missed any part of it, just look for that in your email. Thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks.